I'd like to invite all of you right now to take a hike, not to leave, but to take a hike with my wife and I on a beautiful, beautiful fall day in upstate New York. Now, before we take that hike, before we go on that journey, I'd like to set the stage a little bit. My wife and I, Deborah, live in Manhattan. And we decided one year that we wanted to get out and we wanted to see the leaves change. You know, the Northeast is one of the most beautiful places in the world to see the foliage change. And we decided we'd go during the middle of a week because why go on the weekend when everyone's, busy leafing around, looking around? Let's go and middle of the week, we'll get up there, there'll be no one around, we'll have a great time. And so we leave Manhattan, and on the way up, we get a flat tire. So we have to fix the flat tire, and by the time we get up to the area we were going, which is called the Gunks in New Paltz, New York, it's a beautiful area. And we went up to a state park up there, and we got there around 3:30. Now, I mentioned it's a state park because it was a large state park, and anyone who's ever driven into Manhattan or live in Manhattan realizes that parking spaces are at a premium. Very hard to find parking spaces. But when we drove into this National State Park and we drove into the parking lot, there was just ample parking space. We were just instantly happy. And so we look around, where are we going to park? And we decide, let's just park right at the trailhead. So that's what we do. We pull up to the trailhead and we begin our walk. Now, I remember the day. It was a beautiful, beautiful day. The sky was this magnificent blue. The air was crisp and clean. And the leaves, they were just glittering in gold and red. And we were just having a great time. And my wife and I, we're walking, holding hands, and we're laughing, and we're just having a terrific time. And then we realize it's getting late. We started at 3:30 in the afternoon. It's the fall. So we get a little concerned that if we don't start heading back, we're going to get lost. We don't want to do that. So we start hiking back, and Deborah and I get back to the car, and it is pitch black. It's pitch black. So we decide we're feeling so good, so up, so energetic, that we decide instead of going back to the bed and breakfast and drop our luggage off, we'll go right out to dinner. We'll get a great bottle of red wine. We'll just have a great time. So I turn on the car, turn on the lights, drive out of the parking lot, feeling great. And as we pull out of the parking lot, the headlights illuminate a huge chain across the exit. Now, at first I don't say anything. I know that Deborah and I are thinking the same thing, like, what happened? Wow, the whole day is destroyed. We are locked in a national state park on a Wednesday. The cell phone connections don't even have one bar. What are we going to do? And then I think I suggested to Deborah that maybe she try to make a call, and she said, no, you make the call. And before you know it, we're kind of having this bittering back and forth, and I cannot take it. I can't take it anymore. So I back up the car, the chain, the two posts, and I see a little hill. Back up the car, and I take the car and I drive it up the hill. And just as I'm about to drive up the hill, Deborah says, Andy, stop the car. So I stopped the car. I said, Deborah, what? She said, look at those rocks. If you go up that hill, you're going to kill the carriage of the car, destroy the bottom of the car. And the worst part is she was right. So I had to back up, and we're just now sitting there staring at this chain and feeling really, I don't know, depressed, I don't know, like, not good. And then Deborah says 4 words. 4 words which changes everything. I mean, it just changed everything. And what were those 4 words that she said? Well, before I tell you those 4 words, let me introduce to you a little mind map. The mind map was designed by a management guru named Chris Argyris. And Chris Argyris wanted to look at how we think. What's our thought process? What leads to a decision and to an action? And so he created this metaphor of a ladder with multiple rungs. So I want you to think of this ladder. It's standing up, and the ladder is surrounded by a pool of data, a large pool of data. And from that data, you select data. That's the first rung. You select data. And then you kind of add meaning to that data. And then what you do is you make an assumption. The next rung is the assumption on the ladder. Now, an assumption is something that we take for granted. It's something we treat as a truth rather than a belief. And we often make it subconsciously. So that's the next one. Then the next rung on the ladder is that we add meaning. The next rung on the ladder is that we make a decision. And the next one is that we take action. Now, this is a pretty logical progression of thoughts. It's what makes a lot of sense. Except let's look back and take a step back to Deborah and I. And what did Deborah say that changed everything? Well, she said to me, Andy, where's the lock? And I said, yeah, Deborah, where is the lock? And I get out of the car, and I go over to the chain, and all it is just a chain connected to a post. And so I unhooked the post, unhooked the chain, I walk back to the car, now we're feeling good, and as I get to the car, I look, and underneath the windshield wiper on the driver's side, on my side, was a white piece of paper. And it said, if you leave the park after 5 o'clock, just unhook the chain and make sure you hook it on the way out. Okay, so let's step back. What happened? Deborah and I saw a chain, right? And then we made 2 assumptions. We made the assumption, 1, that we were locked out, and 2, we were alone in the situation. There was no one there to help us. Now, more importantly than that is that once we invested in those 2 assumptions, then what happened is we began to focus on an unrealistic problem that did not exist. We were not locked out, and we were not alone. So, what it tells us is that we as humans have the ability to invest in assumptions which really do not reflect our reality. In its essence, did the chain create the reality? No. Deborah and I created the reality that we were locked in. Now, some might say, well, I don't want to make any assumptions. That's a terrible scenario. But I think it's the greatest lesson in the world. Because if our assumptions have the power to shape our reality, then that means if you're able to recognize the assumptions that you make, and then you're able to manage those assumptions, that you can reshape your reality. You see, in life, we tend to invest in assumptions or invest in data that fit our assumptions, rather than in life to really verify or test that pieces of data that then help us make the right assumptions, the ones that are going to lead us to the goal that we want to get. Now, let me tell you something that's kind of interesting. We, as human beings, really don't want to acknowledge that we make assumptions. We have biases against making assumptions. We think it's a bad thing because we think it reflects on our character, on our IQ, on our personality, on our talent. Let me give you an example of how that assumption should be challenged. Orville Wright, one of the brothers that founded modern aviation, when it was suggested to him that he smooth out the runway, that is, at that time they took off in farm fields with rocks and dungs and holes. Someone said, hey, why don't you smooth it out? And Orville Wright said, the father of modern aviation said, hey, well, if we have to smooth out our runway, we do not deserve to fly. Harry Houdini, the greatest escape artist in the world, was driving in a new model car with his friend. His friend was driving. He gets out of the car, his friend, once they park. Houdini doesn't get out. He's stuck in the car. The friend comes back and says, Houdini, come on, get out. And Houdini says, I can get out of any box, any jail cell, but help me get out of this car. because it was a new car and it had a new design on the door handle. So a simple change in design stymied the greatest escape artist in the world. So we have to first overcome the bias that we make assumptions. We have to realize that assumptions are just part of our decision-making process. And the reason we really don't want to invest in that is because if we do invest in our assumptions and we acknowledge them, then we have to admit that maybe we might not be right all the time. Maybe there are other ways of doing it. So let me give you some ways to identify assumptions, because this is really key. Remember, an assumption is something you take for granted. It is most often subconscious, so you don't even know that you're making them. So let me give you a couple of phrases that act as symptoms an assumption is in play. The first one is, I can't. We've all said that, but I can't is really an assumption. I can't assumes that you are powerless. But more often than not, you're not powerless. You maybe just don't want to do it, right? Maybe you're afraid to try, or maybe you're afraid to fail. Another one is, doesn't anyone get it? Am I the only one who gets that? The assumption is that everybody thinks like you. Everybody thinks like you. And that is a very dangerous assumption because it causes miscommunication among people. It causes us often to invest in a problem that doesn't really exist. So instead of assuming that the world thinks like you, try to see things through the eyes of the other individual. That, to me, is the greatest gift in the world. Because what you're doing by looking at the eyes through somebody else, by challenging the assumption that the world doesn't think like you, what you're doing is you're collecting data. And you're collecting data that begins to verify your assumptions about an individual, about a problem. So therefore, you then can make a greater chance of success in reaching your goals, in eliminating misunderstanding between individuals. So it's very, very important to be able to identify, first acknowledge that you make assumptions, and then identify that you make assumptions. And the reason is that this gives you an opportunity in life to turn around those assumptions which are holding you back, the assumptions holding you back, and you can leverage those assumptions by exploring them, by challenging them, by rejecting them. And that opens up a door that creates a new opportunity to develop ideas and solutions that you never thought existed before. And most importantly, by identifying and then giving yourself a chance to explore, to challenge, to reject, it allows you to drive out that exit. And as you look back, you see your old self still staring at the chain. Thank you.